You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. Whether it's for food, fuel, drinks, or snacks, about half the U.S. population shops at a convenience store every day. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name's Jeff Lenard with NACS.
And I am John Eichberger with the Fuels Institute and NACS, and welcome to the program today.
So today, John, we'd like to talk about testimony. You recently testified before Congress and testified about issues related to fueling, and we're going to distill what is normally a 6 or 8 hour hearing into a compact 20 minutes about what it means and why fuel retailers should care about what this recent testimony might bring forward in terms of new ideas for what we need to do to look at transportation.
So buckle up.
Your presentation, your testimony, you were before the House Energy and Commerce Committee in March 2018. The topic was pretty broad, the future of transportation and fuels. It's about as broad as you're going to get.
Almost.
What was your element? What did you want to get across as a Fuels Institute representative in talking about that issue?
Yeah, and that's the key. I've testified in the past, Jeff, but always as an advocate for NACS. And, I talk about I'm on the 20-step lobbyist recovery program. I've never gotten past step 8. I'm really excited to see what step 9 looks like, but every time I seem to make progress, they pull me back in. So it was interesting to go before Congress this time and talk about a subject without actually advocating an outcome. And since the Fuels Institute does not lobby or advocate, it was kind of an interesting dynamic. So the purpose of the hearing was there are a lot of issues that Congress wants to tackle: renewable fuel standard, corporate average fuel economy standard, various other things related to fuels and vehicles. But before they do that, they wanted to kind of level set the understanding. So one of the DC publications dubbed the hearing Nerd Fest because it was the U.S. Energy Information Administration, 3 PhDs, and then me. I was actually honored to be part of a Nerd Fest. But the topic was, where are we going? What are the current research products that are leading us to anticipate where the transportation system might be in 15 to 20 years? Are we going to have a quick rush of electric vehicles? Is it going to be disruptive change? Is there going to be something that is so dramatically different from what we have today that Congress needs to maybe take a step back and rethink their approach to policy and regulations? And they really wanted to hear from people that don't have a stake in the outcome to really get an idea of where we might be heading.
And that speaks well for the Fuels Institute, because I believe that's the first time the Fuels Institute has been asked to testify.
It is the first time we've been asked to testify. And, it's we're 5 years old now, and I think it is a testament to the fact that we've built an organization that is truly unbiased, that has a diversity of perspectives, and is trying to take an objective look at where the market is, where the market might be heading. We don't have any preference as to how the market evolves. We just want to make sure that people who are making the decisions to drive that evolution actually have realistic information analysis upon which they can make decisions.
So before we get into your specific testimony and what you talked about, just set the table for people. They may have seen on C-SPAN or some other news source what testimony is like. And you have a placard in front of you. You have a series of House of Representatives, members, maybe staff. What is it like? What does it involve? Is it you talking for a bit and then they ask questions? Does it get heated? Take us through that whole process.
So TV is not necessarily reality, and despite how the producers of reality TV want you to think, it does not reflect.
Well, you do know that on reality TV they have writing credits. That's kind of
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
It's kind of a hint it might not be real.
In witnessing and testifying for Congress, you have writing credits too yourself. But basically, you walk in and there's a table for the panel. So there's a panel of 5 of us. There's a 1-panel hearing. And you sit down, you have a microphone in front of you, you have a clock in front of you, and you have 5 minutes. So you submit a written statement for the record, and then you have 5 minutes to summarize your key points. The chairman and the ranking member of the committee, which is the party that's not in power, so the Republicans have the chairmanship and the Democrats have the ranking position, they each give 5-minute opening comments to kind of set their tone for what they want the hearing to go forward with. And then the chairman recognizes each person on the panel for 5 minutes. And so we all give our 5-minute spiel, and then it opens up for Q&A. Now, this hearing, I actually went into, it's a subcommittee hearing. There were 2 other subcommittees having hearings at the exact same time. I expect, and I had breakfast with one of the other panelists before we went in, said, be prepared to have 2 members of Congress, and that's it. The chairman and maybe 1 Democrat. And that's going to be all we get because they have so much competition. You know, Jeff, it was amazing. I'm sitting there throughout the whole hearing. I'm seeing 20 members of Congress. It was a very highly attended session because the members of the Energy and Commerce Committee are so focused on this topic. They want to understand where mobility is going. They want to understand what their constituents have to expect in terms of electrification, gasoline supplies and demand, internal combustion engines, what cars are going to be on the road. It's a very highly anticipated and highly desired topic.
So there's a lot of protocol involved with 5 minutes here and setting the stage. You have 5 minutes. What is the one thing you wanted them to get out of what you were saying, and then how did you phrase it in a way to kind of get their attention?
Well, it's funny because I actually in my statement I said if I can leave you the one thing today, and it is basically the market's going to change, but it's going to change slowly. And I've been using this in my speeches too throughout the last 6 months or so. Is headlines make you think disruption is here, that everything is changing, the massive upheaval. That is not going to happen with anything that's currently on our minds of what could replace or affect the transportation system. So what I really wanted them to do is kind of relax. Stop feeling like we have to get in front of a bullet train here because we're not. If we are in a race to change the market, we have not bought our shoes yet. We haven't identified a venue. We haven't set a date. We don't even know who the opponent is. So there's really no race. We think there's going to be a race at some point, but we don't know what it is. And the headlines and the media want you to think everything is changing, hold on, and here we go. What I wanted them to realize is this is a big market, 250 million vehicles on the road. It takes a very long time to make any substantive change to the market. And I think what was nice is each one of us on the panel, from very different perspectives, we all said essentially the same thing, that we have got a long transition ahead of us. Where we end up, we don't know. There are signs saying we're going a certain direction, but there are so many things that can derail that, and we need to be aware of all those elements.
So I'm glad you used the word disruption because you hear about that in pretty much everything. It's like Bitcoin. You use that in a sentence, and people will give you money.
And they pay attention, right?
Yeah, they pay attention, then they give you money because they think you're really smart.
Right.
So
maybe I should start using that in my speeches so it feels into
Bitcoin
more revenue.
LLC.
Bitcoin disruption, transportation, a paradigm, give me money. Synergies.
So
strategery.
Now, one of the things that you see a lot of, and I just noticed it this past weekend, is you hear about disruption with a lot of other industries, with retail. And starting to see that in the D.C. area, you'd go to a mall, whether it's an indoor mall or an outdoor mall, and you're seeing a couple more for lease signs. So obviously, some of the disruption that really, I think, was first mentioned 3 or 4 years ago, you're starting to see at the retail level, and the manifestation with whether it's Toys R Us or some of these others. Claire's is the latest to join in filing for bankruptcy. Although I think they pointed out that it's going to be difficult to get your ears pierced online, which is one of the things that they're known for. But so getting to the point of disruption, there will be disruption, but it may be 20 years. Is that really the message that we're looking at here?
Yeah, so I shared with the committee a couple graphics and some forecasts that I put together myself on behalf of the Institute. And I'll kind of walk our listeners through the context. I think understanding fundamentals is important. Now, these things can be thrown out of whack by external factors, but first of all, the market's so big. If every single vehicle sold starting January of 2017 was equipped to something new, I wanted to know how long would it take before that feature is present in a majority of vehicles on the road. This is 100% conversion, right? Immediate, instantaneous, forever. It would take about 7 years before 50% of the cars on the road had that feature. And so I put that in context of the electric vehicle market. In 2017, battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles combined for 1.1% of all vehicles sold, far shy of the 100% necessary for a 7-year 50% turn of the market. So to put that in perspective, we got a long way to go.
So if you were even thinking about a simple thing to a vehicle, let's just say that there was a mandate that the sun visors had to look different.
Right.
That would take 7 years for half of the cars to have a simple thing where sun visors need to do this.
And that's 100% mandatory conversion instantaneous.
Now, sun visors are one thing.
Right.
Having a fuel and an engine and a supply chain set up for all those 250 million vehicles, entirely different. So gives a little context to how, yes, change is happening, but it's not happening as fast as one might think.
Now, and then the other thing I wanted to share with them is the whole idea of electric vehicles. And in 2017, battery electric and plug-in hybrids actually had a growth rate in sales of 26%. That is a huge number. And so I said, okay, let's be aggressive on an EV adoption curve. And so I ran the numbers, said if we maintained a 26% annual growth rate in sales through 2025, and then from 2026 to 2035, it dropped to 20%, because the bigger the number gets of sales, harder it is to maintain that rate of growth. This is still an unbelievably aggressive growth rate. If that were to happen through 2035, in 2035, these vehicles represent 43% of all vehicles sold. That is an impressive number. And that's something people go, holy cow, the market is completely turned on its head. But it only is 10.5% of vehicles on the road. With that rate of growth, to have that modest impact on vehicles on the road gives you an idea of the size and scope of what we're talking about here. And there are factors that can go in to accelerate this. But the other thing I want to share with Congress is, look, in order for disruption to occur, and people always point to the horse and buggy yielded to internal combustion engines within 13 years completely flipped the market on its head. Absolutely true. The smartphone, the iPhone debuted in 2007. Now there are more smartphones than smart people. I use that in rooms all the time. It gives a nice chuckle.
There's more smart in halls of Congress?
No, because you don't want to point out the obvious too blatantly, right? But those things gave the consumer a tangible, immediate benefit, lifestyle enhancement, instant. They felt it, they experienced it, it made their lives better. What does an electric vehicle do for the consumer? It delivers them from point A to point B. And we're getting to where it does that in a manner that is consistent and competitive with an internal combustion engine. But does it add substantial benefit to the life? Actually, as of now, it adds inconvenience, because how am I going to recharge? You do have concerns about, can I get to where I want to go? Where am I going to get a plug? How am I going to manage that? So to suggest that battery electric vehicles, which will eventually be cheaper to own, acquire, and maintain than a gasoline engine, are going to lead consumers to abandon what they've been doing for the last 120 years. There's just no real draw to get that customer to make that disruptive change in the market.
And there's a cost factor involved too, because vehicles cost a little bit more than a smartphone. And I've heard presentations.
A little bit more. Not a lot more, but a little bit more.
And I've heard similar presentations where it took 40 years for TVs to reach this size market capitalization or market share. Meanwhile, it took Pokemon Go 19 days to do the same thing. Now, there's a difference between going to a free app and going boop and having it's downloaded good. You got to buy a car. You got to figure out where you're doing it. You got to figure out what you're doing with the old car. All those elements. So I guess when it comes down to it, a lot of the future depends upon supply and demand.
Right.
And I guess supply and demand looking at two different ways. Supply and demand related to what is out there with traditional fuels and what might affect supply and demand with electric. Is there enough of the source to make batteries, for instance? And will that be a contentious issue as whether it's companies or governments look towards where the future is with batteries? Are those factors, whether it's globalization, China, some of these other countries, Will that factor in as a wild card to what happens with electric vehicles?
Yeah, and I think somebody asked me previously, I don't remember where it was, John, I was on a webinar we did for our contributors. Do you see factors enhancing the EV adoption or slowing it? And I honestly believe that most of the factors at play will accelerate it, have the potential to accelerate it. And so let's take that apart a little bit. There's concerns about battery recycling, but there's been advancements in how we recycle batteries and get them back in the market. There's concern about the availability of battery constituents, but we're starting to see new types of batteries being developed. The research,
What do you mean by constituents? That's not like what members of Congress have.
No. The components, lithium, cobalt, those are rare earths that are predominantly located in China. And so there's concerns, can we maintain the supplies to satisfy demand? But we're seeing innovations in battery technology every single week. So I'm not real concerned about that. The big factors that may change this are China. They've declared we're going all electric vehicles by 2040. Why is that important? Well, when the Chinese government decides we're going to do something, they usually do it. It's unlikely that an election is going to unseat them from power anytime soon. So you can assume there's consistency in policy here. Two, they have a parochial interest in the fact that they're producing most of the batteries in the world for electric vehicles. So increasing electric vehicle market share is important to their economy. Three, they have massive environmental issues that tailpipe emissions contribute to. So by reducing tailpipe emissions with the electric vehicle is a good thing for them. But more importantly, in 2016, Chinese purchased 32% of all the vehicles in the world. They have a third market share.
That's astonishing.
And India, their neighbor, has said we're going all electric vehicles by 2030. Combined, those two countries, according to OPEC, by 2040 will have 40% global GDP. If those two countries want to go all electric, and if they are committed to doing that, the rest of the world has to pay attention because it's going to do a couple things. It's going to drive down the cost of batteries. It's going to make the auto companies increase their production of electric vehicles to satisfy that market, which is going to make electric vehicles more cost competitive in every market around the world. And it's going to force the market to transition at a faster rate. These are things we have to be paying attention to because they have that ability to change traditional adoption curves in every country across the globe.
So in these countries, China and India is probably an overgeneralization, or maybe it's not. They tend to have smaller cars. Probably more affordable.
Yeah,
or
somebody
something
told
like
me that 80% of the vehicles sold in India are 2- and 3-wheel vehicles.
So that might be a smaller battery, obviously less expensive. Are there implications there that this might come over here, or is somebody in Texas going to say, that doesn't quite work for how I live?
We're not giving up our trucks. And that's one of the other things that slows down disruption is we have a passion for the current vehicle fleet we have. The majority of Americans, they like the car they have. It has a utility aspect to it. They're not going to give it up for a 3-wheel vehicle. Mobility in China and India is a very different issue than mobility in the United States. But I think the influence of those countries on technology readiness, technology affordability, and applicability is important. We're not going to buy the same vehicles they're buying in China and India.
So basically, if you have 0 wheels and then you have 3, that's good.
Right.
And if you have 4, you're not going to say, 3's good.
Right. You're not going to downgrade the number of wheels you have. You may increase to 6 because you need more payload.
So you presented all this before Congress. Was there a particular question or was interest, whether afterwards or in emails afterwards, that you knew something resonated with somebody where okay, this is a good point that we need to have a discussion much deeper?
Not particularly. I think the fact that all 5 of us on the panel were delivering a similar message was impactful, and I think that speaks volumes. Members of Congress come to hearings with questions written by their staff and sometimes by their constituents, by the stakeholders with whom they have an affinity, who they've been working with. So some of the questions we were asked were very much written by outside parties. And that's all right, because that is consistent with what the member of Congress is concerned about with their back home district. But they weren't really all big picture questions, For example, there's a line of questioning from one member of Congress with a colleague on the panel all about if the current administration slows down or repeals the fuel economy standards, how big of a travesty will that be? And it was 5 minutes of questions on that question. Questions I got really kind of harken back to my times representing NACS, because a lot of the people on the committee know my history, were about infrastructure compatibility with biofuels, marketing strategies for certain biofuel blends, what it would take to transition infrastructure to handle something new. We had a little conversation on octane, because the Fuels Institute has a new study coming out in the summer of 2018 on octane. So each one of us had different questions directed at us based upon what the member of Congress wanted to hear. But I really think the biggest message is you had 5 very different perspectives basically telling Congress, slow your horses. We're not in a sprint here. This is a long marathon that may be a super marathon, and we need to settle in for the long haul.
And you mentioned horses. That's where we started with cars. But it really, I think it does set up where we are, in that it was probably much easier for the initial inventors of the automobile, the internal combustion engine, and the Model T, to work from a blank slate and to create something that hadn't been created. Now, granted, in the early days, there were gas stations, which were really just shacks where they would pour liquid in, or they would go to pharmacies or whatever. But then you can kind of build something. It's a little harder when you have to look at the 250 million vehicles on the road, and how do you affect change there? Because change really could happen a lot quicker if nothing existed than replacing something, because there has to be a benefit to the consumer to make the change, and for everybody to go along with figuring out, here's how we serve change.
And change is going to happen. Change is happening. We're seeing it. We had a speaker from the Rocky Mountain Institute give a presentation a while back, and he reminded the audience 100 years ago, the primary energy for transportation was hay. That's a big deal. Now, as you said, scale matters. And so that's really what the change is struggling with, is scale, motivation. And I ask people all the time, what on the horizon from a transportation solution perspective has the ability to deliver tangible, immediate consumer value? Then we have something to think about that might replace our current transportation system. But until that materializes, we're going to continue doing small steps here and there with an eye on the future, but that future is indeterminate as to when we actually arrive.
So as people look towards what the future is, and whether they Google or whether they read the newspaper or read magazines, what are key words or things that they might want to look at in terms of seeing how change is happening in the fuels industry? What are the key words? Is it looking at lithium? Is it looking at China? Is it looking at what other things out there? Obviously, Tesla is a big conversation point, but there's pros and cons to that.
I don't know that I can identify keywords to look for. I guess the practice I would recommend is ask who and why. If you're reading an article that's saying something, ask why is it saying that, and who is the source. That's going to tell you more than you can possibly realize. And then second of all, ask the question, how? What is this? How can this possibly materialize? The headline is going to, if it bleeds, it leads. Remember, the headline's going to be sensationalized. The details are what matters. The source matters. The motivation behind the writer matter. And then you can start developing a broader perspective of how potential changes in the market might affect your business, your lifestyle, and what you might want to be doing to take advantage of opportunities as they emerge.
And that's an excellent point, because that really gets to does somebody have a vested interest? And one of the great things about the Fuels Institute is there isn't that vested interest. It is everyone working together to deliver information, and that I think can cut through the clutter in terms of what the future will look like. So I think that's a really important consideration. So where can people find out about the testimony you have and some of these papers that the Fuels Institute puts out?
fuelsinstitute.org. Everything we do is publicly available, free for download. All we ask is you give us your email address. We know who downloaded it. We can make sure that you have access to our stuff going forward. We have a newsletter that's open to anybody that wants it. Comes out once a month. And if you have questions, just give us a call. We're happy to talk to anybody about this. As you can imagine, I can talk for hours on these subjects, and I love doing it. So happy to talk to anybody who wants to talk.
And you give testimony.
Yes, I do. I testify, baby.
Thank you for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in conjunction with Human Factor Media. For more information, visit convenience.org.